I think it's time to start. So, thank you very much for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Jonathan Wells from London. Jonathan did his PhD at Cambridge University, then he moved to UCLA, University College of London, where he is at the moment a professor of anthropology and pediatric nutrition. So please, Jonathan.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. A great opportunity to have to present about obesity and adipose tissue. So if you were looking at body fat from a public health point of view, our main concern is when people have too much. And so the title of the talk could be The Evolution of Human Obesity. Where did it all go wrong? Why do we have now globally so many people who have high levels of body weight? But I want to give the opposite perspective to start with and then come back and ask why we have the obesity crisis. Because from an evolutionary point of view, I think that a better title for this talk would be The Evolution of Human Adiposity. What a success story. I think adipose tissue is as important in the story of human evolution as having a large brain, walking upright, being intelligent, and being social. So, if you add the two things together, it's the interaction between our very complex and sophisticated adipose tissue, the biology, with what we can call environmental perturbations that ends up generating a new situation, having too much fat. So, if you look at the early evolutionary approaches to adiposity or obesity, you immediately find this word thrift. We have the thrifty genotype hypothesis that was presented by James Neal in 1962. The idea that some individuals were exposed to cycles of feast and famine, and they evolved alleles that were good for storing fat, and that was really good in the past, but now if you put these alleles in an environment of a constant food supply, some people will get too fat. This is a very debatable hypothesis. It's a wonderful idea and it stimulates everyone. But when you look for these thrifty alleles, they're not really there. People struggle to find thrifty alleles. Then you've got the other angle, the environmental, biological angle of the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, that it's about plasticity, that there's something that happens to us during our life course that makes it more likely that we'll gain excess weight and pay some of the health costs associated with that. So thrift is a really nice word to think about. A dictionary definition of thrift would be prosperity, having something, from frugality, not using it in the past. The careful management of resources, what we have in our bank account. And you could be thrifty in a number of different ways. You could reduce your energy expenditure. You could be smaller. You could get rid of expensive organs like our large brain. You could do nothing, torpor, hibernation. And this little mouse hibernates for 8 to 10 months of the year. Or you could store energy in the body, and that's another strategy. But there's much more to thrift than just having fat stores. And there's much more to having fat stores than just calling it a form of thrift. Fat is very biologically active, and I already know from a couple of conversations that some of you in this room know much more than me about what adipose tissue can actually do metabolically. And also there's much more to body fat than obesity. That's the most important message. So we can approach body fat from an evolutionary angle from a number of different ways, but going past the thrifty genotype and thrifty phenotype hypotheses, we could draw on life history theory. That's what we often use in evolutionary biology. Life history theory assumes that for every organism, energy is a scarce resource, and that each organism is under selective pressure to allocate energy optimally across competing functions: maintenance, growth, defense, and reproduction. The conventional view is that all organisms do that on a moment-by-moment basis. There's always an optimal thing to do with your energy. But the optimal strategy then varies. How old are you? Which sex are you? What is your nutritional status? Because that might change the value of energy. And what kind of environmental stresses or stimuli is the organism facing? Now, when life history theory was first proposed and applied to humans, the general idea was that there were three functions. You maintain the body in good condition, which includes defending it from threats. You can grow larger, and you can reproduce. And the trade-offs are that you can't do all of those. So, for example, a mammal tends to stop growing and then start producing offspring. But when we looked at the data, we really felt that defense should be isolated as a separate life history function. Defense is very expensive. Running an immune system is metabolically expensive, but it also causes a lot of damage to the body. It really impairs maintenance. If you're inflamed, you damage your arterial health, and that leads to cardiovascular disease. So there's a massive trade-off between defense and maintenance. And there are two key elements of defense. We often talk about immune function, the pathogens, but the stress response is also very expensive. And for humans, it's particularly important for understanding public health issues, including obesity. So then we can think about how body fat really buys time. What we've had in human evolution is a pattern of evolving different forms of phenotypic plasticity that give us flexibility. And that flexibility and that plasticity reduces the strength of selection acting on the genes, because instead of the alleles being directly exposed to selection, we can shift our phenotype, wriggle out of the selective pressures. So if we think about human evolution, over the long term, what we see is that the world became cooler. Now we think the world's getting hotter, but over the last 5 million years, the world became cooler. And that's the context, the last 5 million years in which the Australopithecines and the genus Homo emerged. That's our story of human evolution. And when we try and think about the traits that humans have from an evolutionary perspective, these traits are somehow solutions to the environments that we evolved in. So we look at a human, we say, got a big brain. We are bipedal, which means we freed our hands. We've got very interesting hands, they're very dexterous. We can do lots of sophisticated activities. And our brain is very social. Bits of the brain that's expanded are very good at social activities. And that co-occurred with the spread of the savanna ecosystem in sub-Saharan Africa, which, as far as we know, is where human evolution took place. So these traits, walking upright, having a big brain, having opposable thumbs and so on, must in some way be solutions to the savanna niche. We got those traits because humans did better in that environment. But there's something else that was happening which has had less attention, which is that while the world was getting cooler, it was also getting more and more volatile. So these delta units on the y-axis here, it's just temperature. It's isotopic markers of the global temperature. And you can see these bigger and bigger oscillations in temperature. Now, when the oscillations get really big, that means that the ecosystem is changing so fast that it's no longer changing across generations. It's starting to change within generations, especially for a long-lived animal like a human. And you notice that the evolution of Homo around 2 million years ago, you could say it sort of coincides with these oscillations getting larger. And then you look at our own species, Homo sapiens, and the oscillations have got larger still. As a species, we're a species that seems to have done well in these unpredictable environments. So maybe the traits that we have are traits that help us deal with changeable, unpredictable environments. So let's think about humans as a generically thrifty species, because being thrifty is a way of not committing to an environment that's constantly changing. Compared to other primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, we have less muscle mass. We're kind of under-muscled, less lean mass. And we have more body fat compared to the other three primates, particularly females. Humans have higher levels of body fat. So we've got a thrifty body composition. We've got a thrifty growth pattern. We take almost a decade and a half to 2 decades for our offspring to reach maturity. And that's partly related because we have low mortality, but it also suggests that the costs of growth have been distributed over a much longer period, and that makes growth cheap. So if you think of the life history function of growth, it's just become cheaper. But then we have cooperative breeding. Individual mothers receive a lot of help from others in the social group. Maybe a male partner, it may be sisters, aunts, parents, and so on. Grandparents became very important in human evolution. So the cooperative breeding reduces the direct energy costs on the individual mother. It helps her meet the costs of her baby with a very large brain, very metabolically expensive brain. And then we have our complex adipose tissue biology. And that's the bit that I think we can be really interested in from an evolutionary perspective. This is a sort of schematic diagram that shows the life course trajectory of human biology. It's not got any particular age axis, I've just marked where you end up at different points in the life course. Humans start life with low levels of lean mass for their height, but a lot of fat. And then they get much fatter in infancy, which suggests that for infants, fat's a very valuable trait. This doesn't just happen, it must have functional payoffs. But then the infants lose the fat. So children clearly don't need fat as much as infants do. But then you start to see the emergence of a profound sexual dimorphism where males invest particularly in lean tissue, muscle mass, and females go back to investing more in fat tissue. And so you get a state at adulthood that men have more lean and less fat, and women have more fat and less lean. So clearly the two sexes are valuing body fat very differently, but mainly in adulthood. In early life, they're valuing fat much more similarly. Well, like any trait we look at, there's a genetic component of the variability in our body fat. Different studies give you different answers. If you look at family studies, they suggest a medium level of heritability of body fat. Twin studies and adoption studies both indicate a high heritability. So yes, adiposity is very heritable, but the small print is that it's a very polygenetic trait. There are many, many different alleles that impact someone's fatness, but they all have a small magnitude of effect. We tend to evaluate adiposity genes in terms of their effect on BMI, body mass index. And each allele just nudges up and down body mass index a little. So if you want to predict someone's body fatness from their genotype, you need to get their genome and add up all the different alleles that they have that nudge up BMI, and you can get a polygenetic risk score for BMI. So yes, it's heritable, but it's hard to picture that these individual alleles are strongly individually under selection. Where's that genetic variability come from? Well, we went through a bottleneck. When Homo sapiens emerged, it was a very small population size. And so although there must have been very wide variability in Homo erectus, at the start of our own species, there must have been a narrow level of genetic diversity. But then, because humans got all around the world and started doing different forms of agriculture, we must have had genetic diversity emerging all over again. And we also interbred with some other Homo species, some of which are well known, the Neanderthals and others which are not really described, the Denisovans. So we have archaic homogeneous genes that entered the human genome. Red hair came from Neanderthals. I think that's right. It's a simplistic explanation, but I think that's right. But the extraordinary thing is that having got to so many different environments, we're not actually a very genetically diverse species. The size of these trees on this plot indicate the total magnitude of genetic diversity. And if you look at the yellow and the green and the blue trees in the middle, those are the chimpanzees. Even the eastern and central chimpanzee populations alone actually display overall more genetic diversity than the whole of the human species. So we're a species that is extraordinarily genetically conserved. We have some genetic variability, of course we do, but given the different habitats that we occupy around the world, we've not done it by genetic diversification, whereas the chimpanzees have. They've committed genetically to different environments. So what are all these alleles doing? Well, I think a lot of them are bet hedging. They're just alleles that help spread the risk of the way we respond to environmental stresses almost randomly in a population. It's not so much that you are adapting to doing well in a good environment, it's avoiding doing badly in a bad environment. So our adiposity alleles turn out to link with many, many different aspects of human biology. Thermoregulation, producing heat, the ability to process different diets, starch, protein, whatever. Cognition, reproduction, defense, both immune defense and the stress response, and growth. And so body fat genes, what we call BMI alleles, actually turn out to be alleles that are involved in all of these different functions. So if you think of how natural selection shaped our adiposity genome, it went through all of these different pathways. All of those were selective pressures acting back on our adiposity alleles. So we are the ultimate colonizing ape. The gorillas are sitting there in very small patches of African forest under threat from humans. The chimpanzees are sitting there in very small patches of forest under threat from humans, and the orangutans and the gibbons, same story in Asia. But humans have gone everywhere. And Homo erectus managed to get halfway across the world with very little culture, just through its biology, was able to tolerate and adapt to many, many different ecosystems. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has got everywhere. I mean, Antarctica is probably the continent where you really do need a high level of culture to exist, but in the Arctic, the Inuit were able to occupy high latitudes with only moderate levels of culture. So we've got to all of these different environments, and yet we haven't genetically diversified. So that makes us think about colonizing as its own selective pressure. Maybe it's not being in an environment that's the human story. Maybe it's being able to get to different environments and survive in any of them that's the human story. So it's like a cycle. You have an organism that has the genetic capacity to cope with ecological variability. That kind of organism can go and probe new territory, find a new niche, and actually occupy that niche and settle in it. In that new niche, the organisms will be exposed to new stresses, so there's more selective pressure to be able to tolerate environments. So that would favour the evolution of even greater plasticity. And so you keep going around the cycle, and the colonizing, where you keep entering new niches, ramps up the selective pressure. And you become more and more adaptive in a plastic sense, and you've taken all the pressure off the genome. So we come back to fat as a form of risk management. Fat does this generic thing. It buffers the body from all sorts of different environmental stresses, so it pushes back against selective pressures targeting the genome. But what fat also does is it can provide energy for all four life history functions. It can fund growth, it can fund reproduction, it can fund maintenance, it can make sure that there's energy available for maintenance, and it can fund immune function and the stress response. So you can think of fat as a kind of a generalized energy currency. It's like cash. I can spend my cash in a restaurant, I can go and buy a house if I was doing very well, I could buy a car, I could give funding to my family. So it's like a bank balance, and therefore having that store of energy means that to some extent you can now detach your life history strategy from ongoing in and out dynamics. It doesn't matter if I ate today a big meal or a small meal. It's not going to change whether I invest in my maintenance or my growth or my reproduction, because if I have a shortfall, I'll just draw on my energy reserves and make up the difference. It also allows us to convert lots of different raw materials into a common unit. Someone gives me some food, that's calories in the food. Someone helps me by lifting some boxes around my house. They've saved me the physical effort. So it doesn't matter which of those two things someone does, effectively they've transferred some energy to me. Someone babysits my child. They've just taken on some of the energy costs of parental care. So body fat is something that you can pay out and pay in different raw units, but in the end the currency is just energy. And that allows us to allocate the energy selectively between the different functions. Actually, body fat's only one of two. I mean, today you could say we have cash, that's the third one. But from an evolutionary perspective, we can think of two in particular. So we can think of physical capital stored in the body, and we can think of social capital stored in our social relations. I help you today because I'm hoping that if I have a problem, you'll help me tomorrow. Maybe I help you build a house, which is a big task today. You help me build a house tomorrow. So essentially we store body fat, we store energy in both body fat, in the body, and in our social relationships. So energy is distributed within the body and across bodies. And that increases our capacity to allocate energy to optimize fitness. If I'm on my own and there's no food, I can use my own energy reserves. So I think that really helps think about how we tackle ecological risks in different ways. If the risk affects the individual, such as foraging failure, you go to someone else and you ask if they can help. So Humans are very good at that. Human foragers, hunter-gatherers, share their food. If I don't catch an antelope, someone else did, so we all eat the antelope together. But what happens when there's a risk that affects everyone in the group? If there's no antelope because there was a big forest fire or a flood or something, no one's got an antelope. What are you going to do? Now you can oxidize your body fat stores. So body fat is a kind of a personal insurance that's ring-fenced in the body. And why different individuals have different levels of body fat? They've got different levels of insurance. Maybe amongst this room, different people have invested differently in insuring your house or your bike or your car or something because you are thinking about risk in different ways. So storing different levels of body fat is different levels of risk. And of course there are metabolic costs to storing fat. There are benefits, but high levels of body fat also have cardiometabolic risks. So with our fat, we can smooth over ecological perturbations. So in the top line on the graph here, this is just ecological conditions. Sometimes it's good, there's food available. Sometimes it's bad, you can't find any food. That means that on a day-to-day basis, sometimes you bring in energy to the body, other times you expend energy going foraging, but you don't find anything. So it's a daily negative energy balance. And the body fat stores smooth it all over, so that you've always got some energy available until you really hit nothing. You've run out of body fat, which turns out to be extremely bad for health and survival. So these are data from the literature looking at the way that different tissues in humans respond to severe famine. Now what's interesting is that actually almost every tissue gets smaller. And in the Second World War, the Leningrad siege, even the brain got smaller. So no tissue is immune from starvation. Interestingly, the heart and the liver get smaller during starvation. But the obvious tissue that has the biggest change is adipose tissue. So for obvious reasons, that's the point, or one point of adipose tissues, to protect the other tissues. But muscle tissue also goes down as well. So the body sacrifices different tissues in different ways, and fat is the one that is going to carry the biggest stress. But actually, although we often think that humans evolved body fat to deal with famine, actually the ecologists and the historians tell us and the archaeologists tell us that famine is a relatively recent stress, and it correlates with inventing agriculture and having settled communities who can't just migrate away when times get tough. So famines are paradoxically probably not the stress that really shaped body fat through human evolution. Famines are a new stress, and how much body fat people has turns out to be important in terms of whether they can survive or not. So what was body fat really for? Well, these are data from a farming population in the Gambia. Although they're farmers, probably the kind of conditions they're experiencing are similar to some foragers. These are farmers, and as you can see, every year the women have a body weight change that averages 3 kilograms, but can be as much as 5 kilograms. And most of that weight change is body fat. And the reason that happens is that in these Gambian villages, half the year they work very hard in the fields producing food, and the other half of the year they eat the food that they've grown. So they have what's called a hungry season when they have lots of work and no food, and a harvest season when they have plenty to eat and they don't need to work very hard at all. And those body fat changes reflect what's happening to the women as they either do have plentiful food or not. Why are they storing food? They're storing food, as you'll see in a moment, for reproduction. But in this population, it's possible. There have been records of women who've actually gained 0 fat during a reproductive cycle. They had to get by without any fat. So fat's not necessary for reduction, but it's really useful. One reason that infants evolved body fat is to protect the brain. You can see that the proportion of body weight that is the brain changes very markedly through the life course, and infants in relative terms have a very large brain, and the brain has obligatory requirements for glucose or at least some other fuel, which could be ketones. So on the graph here on the left-hand axis, you can see brain body basal metabolic rate as a percentage of total. So a newborn, pretty much 90% almost of your total BMR, your basal metabolic rate, is going to fund the brain. And that means that your glucose requirements, grams per kilogram per day, are their greatest. If you run out of glucose, the brain is under threat. And so Kuzawa suggested in this article in 1998 that infants have fat to protect the brain. They need to buffer the energy supply of the brain. If there's not glucose coming in from lactation, then the body can break down fat, produce ketones, and ketones are a substrate that can be used by the brain. And of course, that means that to get the energy into the infant, it has to come from the mother. So these are skin-fold thicknesses across the first 5 years of life, the month postpartum of women from a population of Papua New Guinea, showing very nicely the decline in body fat as lactation is funded. Lactation is much more expensive than pregnancy for women. When women gain weight in pregnancy, it's to fund lactation. Obviously, the offspring is a lot bigger, the brain's a lot bigger, so the metabolic costs of an infant are much more expensive than the metabolic costs of a fetus. So fat is gained during pregnancy and then released back to the offspring during infancy through lactation. And that means that women value fat very differently through the life course. These are data on the waist-hip ratio, the waist BMI ratio and the thigh-hip ratio. And you can see that young women, whether or not they reproduce, have a high ratio of the thigh relative to the hip. That's because the thigh is where a lot of the adipose tissue is actually stored that goes to the brain of the baby. There are particular fatty acids in the thigh adipose tissue depot that go to the brain of the baby. So women store fat in the thighs ready for lactation, and then they lose it. Meanwhile, the waist to BMI ratio goes up through the life course. So there's a redistribution of body fat in women. During your reproductive career, it's available in peripheral fat depots ready to fund lactation, reproduction. As you get older, then the body fat shifts to central body areas where it's more important for immune function, what we call inflammatory. And men don't show those changes at all, because there's only one use of body fat for men through the life course, which is funding defense or funding protection from energy stress. So it doesn't matter what BMI a man is through the life course. If you know a man's BMI, you also pretty much know his waist adjusted for hips. It's relatively constant in this large sample. So men don't shift weight around the body other than just getting heavier or lighter. Okay, so adiposity is particularly important for immune function. So when we have infections, they generate a number of costs. We need to repair our tissue. If it's damaged, we need to defend tissues by producing lots of immune molecules. If we have a fever, that's energy. We're burning off the fever, the pathogen, so we need to raise our metabolic rate and burn more calories. We might need to produce cells, such as lymphocytes or antibodies. And of course, the pathogen may be growing and having its metabolism, and we have to fund that as the host. So an infection imposes a lot of energy costs on the body. And body fat responds to that by providing the energy for immune function and also providing some of the molecular precursors which go to make these immune agents. This is a graph that really highlights the value of body fat, both from a metabolic sense and from a more pathway perspective. These are data from East African children. On the left, you've got the children who survived, and on the right, you've got the ones who died. The few who died had almost zero levels of leptin, the hormone that comes out of adipose tissue, but it's also a gateway hormone for regulating immune function. Those children who died could not signal from their body fat that they could run their immune function, and so those were the ones who died. One of the things I'm particularly interested in, it's one of the hypotheses that I've made, I haven't yet had the opportunity to really test it, is that different populations may have different body fat distributions because they face different types of infectious disease. And just to take two examples, we have a disease like malaria, which targets our blood cells. And we respond to that with a fever. We try and burn off the pathogen. We have intramuscular fat globules that can be used to provide that energy. Then we have other diseases like a gut pathogen. And I'm not going to try and explain this in detail here, but when people die of cholera, the pathway there is very, very different from the pathway to dying from malaria in terms of where the metabolic stress is in the body. So, without trying to get into the detail, I would suggest that the reason why some populations, such as in Africa, store more fat in intramuscular tissue, and why other populations, such as South Asian, store more fat as visceral fat, may relate to the best place to locate fat in order to defend against different types of disease, because South Asian populations with the monsoon are much more exposed to waterborne pathogens. So, a hypothesis that may be ethnic differences both in the distribution of body fat and the inflammatory profile might help explain why the metabolic costs of the obesity epidemic are different in different populations. So far, I've been unable to do anything except propose this hypothesis. I don't still know if it's supported or not. So we know that adipose tissue is closely associated with immune function, but we also know that there's a two-way association between adiposity and the stress response. Stress is one of the key factors that's being linked with excess weight gain. People eat, they comfort eat. Depression is very different. People can lose their appetite in depression, but under stress, it tends to elevate appetite. However, we also know that people with higher levels of body fat change the way that they respond to cortisol. So there's a two-way street between stress and adipose tissue. This is a small study that we did in the UK. We like doing small experiments on metabolism. This was a study when we took a sample of young men who all had overweight, and we randomized them to either watch TV, the comedy show Friends, or to play the FIFA football game, or to play the violent game Call of Duty. And based on our previous studies, we thought that the violent game would do more. Actually, the two video games together both elevated appetite. People ate more in a test meal after playing the video game than they did after watching TV. We were very interested in violence as a particular sort of psychological stimulus of stress, but people who work on video games tell us that the way they really stress people is they frustrate you. You don't care if you're going to die in Call of Duty, but you're really frustrated you're not winning the game. And apparently it's the frustration that elevates the stress response. But overall, the two video games both increased appetite in our test meal, and the violent game a little bit more than the football game. So overall, we can think of metabolism as a kind of an allocation game. We take in food, and we've got to do something with the calories in the food. We could burn the calories, we could do some maintenance, keep our DNA in good condition, keep our body temperature up. We could synthesize something, breast milk, body fat, neurogenesis. We could have physical activity, or we could produce offspring. Or we could store the energy, and then we can store the energy in lots of places. We could store it in a functional tissue like the brain, or organs, or muscles, or we could have some kind of fuel depot, a petrol tank. And again, there's choices. We've got glycogen in muscle, that's one petrol tank. Then we've got adipose tissue, body fat for lipids, but we've also got different depots, peripheral body fat depots and deep visceral body fat depots. And they all have different implications for both health and Darwinian fitness. And the idea is that this is a game that we all have to play, and that how we play that game depends on our life course traits and the ecological conditions that we're exposed to. And then all the hormonal signals, and now we would say the metabolomic signals, that relate to adipose tissue are how we're playing that game. The most obvious hormones for me are insulin, leptin, ghrelin, resistin, adiponectin, but also growth factors, also interleukins. Adipose tissue sends and receives countless signals, and again, I'm sure many of you know much more about them than I do. So, actually fat is one of two ways that humans manage risk. We've got two risk management organs, adipose tissue and the brain, and they do very different things. The brain looks after the short-term stresses. You see the leopard coming towards you, it's an immediate threat. You need to do something. It's probably going to involve physical activity or a very quick social negotiation. Get rid of that habit. So that's one risk management system. And that deals with these acute threats. But what about all of the threats that emerge in a way that's not easy to actually see? The risk of a pandemic. What's my risk of getting infected? I can't think about that all day, every day. It would drive me mad. But my immune system might be doing that. So we have all sorts of signals that are coming out of the environment and longer term stresses. And our body fat essentially calculates everything out of all of those signals and sets our body fat level as some kind of risk management system that we draw. We build up fat when it's there. We use body fat when we need it. And we're kind of smoothing over all those signals. We're dealing with them. We're dealing with the fact that we don't know how much food we'll get each day. We don't know when we will or won't be infected. We don't know when we're in a stressful social situation where we might have to burn more calories. So I've tried to say that body fat is actually incredibly sophisticated, and that the story of human evolution was the evolved greater sophistication of this tissue. We have more fat. It seems to do more things than in chimpanzees and gorillas. And I don't think we would have got to survive as a hominin if we hadn't had this body fat. It's just as important as our big brains. Okay, but if it was all so great, why is it going wrong? Why are we now so concerned with the global epidemic of obesity? So I'm not going to try and address this in detail. I'm going to leave you with more of a kind of an overarching perspective on what's going wrong. So we could look at many secular trends. We've changed our diets. We have more food security. We have high-calorie foods. We don't need to work very hard physically to get our food or our shelter. We've changed the cost of infection. We vaccinate children. They don't get sick as much. They don't burn as many calories on immune function. So if they build up fat as a baby, they may never use it. They may just keep it. And one of the things that I saw my supervisor do during my PhD was show that children's body fat in the 1990s was much higher as children than in the 1970s because of the consequences of vaccination. We're exposed to pollutants that may perturb our adipose tissue biology. We've got heating, central heating. We don't have to burn calories to keep warm in the same way that we did. We're changing our circadian rhythms. This is really complicated, but we know that there are associations between sleep patterns and obesity. So as we sit up late with our new electric lighting, I mean, relatively new, and our TVs and our computers, changing our sleep patterns, changing our exposure to light signals that affect melatonin, affect our biology that way. And we live in much bigger social communities. So we may not have the threat of famine, but we've got these really complex hierarchies where we constantly need to interact with people of different social statuses. Our social life is very common in our complex, in our family, in our community, in our country, and so on. So we've got these secular trends, and they're all involved in the obesity pandemic. But that's not really an answer. That's just, these are the proximate causes. Why do these social stresses reach our adipose tissue biology? Why do they have effects? They're all subject to commercial interests. And that's the bit that I think is still missing from the biomedical perspective on obesity, that if it does look at risk factors, it'll say, well, some people eat a high-fat diet. That correlates with obesity. Why are people eating a high-fat diet? That comes back to the way that we construct society. And this is one way that we can look at obesity and also undernutrition. Every food system today is actually a financial system. And there's many different pathways connecting different agents. So the medical model of obesity is that here we have a person. How fat's the person? It's about the characteristics of that person. That person has a polygenetic risk score for how fat they are. I can ask what that person eats, how active they are. I'll learn something about that person if I ask those questions. But I'm not really going to understand what society is producing people with high levels of body fat. This is a much better explanation for understanding that obesity isn't about just people. There are lots of other agents in the food system. There are corporations who are trying to make profits. out of selling foods and also selling other things that impact our lives. There's governments who are kind of playing a two-handed game because they want the GDP that comes with commercial growth, but they also want population health so they can cut their hospital costs. So governments have very complex relationships. They're dealing with both corporations and individuals. But perhaps the player that hasn't received enough attention is who's acting on the governments. We often make a model of obesity where we think the government's the top. The government makes its public health decisions and everything happens below that. But governments are often interacting with international financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. And you start to look at these associations, it gets very interesting because world trade regulations often involve financial relationships whereby, for example, the government may not put a tax on an obesogenic product. You can't tax soft drinks in a certain country because World Trade Organization rules forbid that to happen. So the government knows it could improve public health by putting that tax on, but the company could sue it, so it can't. So the whole financial structure is actually part of the obesogenic picture because we can't understand this wheel, the one containing the individual, without understanding all the other wheels. This is particularly relevant to what we call nutrition transition, very rapid changes in diet in the global south as new processed foods come in as part of this picture. And many of the commercial interests perturb either our behavior or our metabolism. Just to pluck out a few, we can change social norms, we can change how we value foods. And if you look around the world, there's always some foods that have got cachet, we ascribe status to them. Sometimes some populations ascribe status to high body weight. And the way that products are presented through the media can manipulate how we value them. If we see a famous person use something, we value that thing more. There's automatic decisions. We like to think that we go shopping and we make decisions, but supermarkets are brilliant at making our decisions for us. Where they put products, how they price them, how they package them, how they brand them. I have a colleague in the School of Hygiene, Rebecca Sear, who says that many of our decisions, not really decisions, they're rationalizations of what we just did. I bought the food, I look at it and I go, oh, there must have been a reason for that. I now need to work out what the reason was. But it was an instinctive choice. TV advertising is another way of trying to manipulate our decisions. And then we have lots of metabolic manipulations, putting sugar or sweet taste in foods, manipulating our insulin dynamics, stimulants, nicotine and caffeine. And then there are behaviors that are designed to be addictive. Video game is addictive precisely because it's frustrating. You never win, so you need to play another time. So that has implications for, as I've shown you, for appetite. And frustration, and hence promoting appetite, is built into the video game. So who should be the target of interventions? And this is something that I often try and suggest as an idea. We often think that if you wanted an intervention on obesity, it would be targeting the people. Let's educate people not to eat fast food. Let's educate people to be more active. We have a situation in the UK where childhood obesity is strongly linked with the food outlets around the school. So children go to school, they come out, and they buy fast food on the way home. So the classic approach would be to educate the families of the children, don't buy the fast food. So if you did an intervention and it worked, you would say, well, what causes obesity is eating food, eating fast food. But if you did a different intervention and what you did was in a city, you legally closed half of the fast food outlets and you let the others remain, and in the place where you'd shut the fast food outlets, there was no longer any childhood obesity, you wouldn't say eating fast food makes children fat, you would say selling fast food makes children fat. That's where we really have the problem with obesity. We don't get the real cause of obesity. We're too focused on individuals as living lifestyles that are making them fat, and we're not focused enough on the agents who are making profit from those lifestyles making people fat. We could also think about governments as the target of interventions as well as the source of interventions. So thank you very much for listening. If anyone's brave, there are 2 books that address these issues in more detail. The first one is much more about the biology of body fat and how it, I think, played a part in human evolution. The second one tries to link our metabolic story through all aspects of human evolution with our power relations, our social dynamics. It tries to pull out the story of how our metabolism is affected by our social dynamics. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. And questions? Oh, I need some light. I have one, of course. But I'm saying that the current human society, including the corporations and international funding agencies, government, and all sorts of things, is just exploiting our ancient survival strategy. So they, yeah, because we are quite well adapted, as you said, to put up weight, gain fat, and that was really adaptive in that environment, and now they are just exploiting these kind of things. Is that?
I think what I've shown you is our body fat is very responsive to lots of different ecological stresses because fat is so important for every life history function. So it doesn't matter what changes in the environment, our body fat will probably respond in one way or the other. And corporations, you know, what they've done is very impressive in the sense that they've reverse engineered how to get more calories into people, and they're very good at it.
Yeah.
Their strategies are successful, but that's also because they don't pay the costs when the levels of body fat rise to unhealthy levels. So then that's why a societal perspective, I think, helps. If we do nothing for corporations, they will continue to be very successful. So I think in science we're playing catch up. Because corporations want to see calories enter human bodies, they've got half a century or more of research on how to make that work.
Yeah.
The scientists started about 3 decades later, thinking, how can we stop making that work? And initially all the focus was on the individual. And I think, as I've been saying, we've missed the fact that interventions targeting only the individual that don't really target the corporations have limited potency. So obviously there are interventions that do target corporations. There's different forms of sugar tax on beverages, but it's extremely difficult to regulate companies. The commercial legal status of companies is that they have the right to make profit. And so paradoxically, it's much harder to intervene on companies than on individuals, even though I think we're at the stage where without that, it's very difficult to make successful interventions.
It's not a good news. Yeah.
So it's an interesting talk to discuss. We are not in the evolution of biology in general, but in the biomedical research related to obesity research. So 2 things that came into mind. One is that recently it became very obvious and people, researchers made it clear in the medical science that overweight is not necessarily a disease state. So an evolutionary perspective, it's quite understandable. So the concept that being overweight is already a kind of pathogenic situation should be really eliminated from the society, of thinking of society, and putting pressure on people on losing weight. And this, your talk and this approach certainly strengthens this argumentation. The other is, it came to mind that now you have to consider a very new element of evolution in a way, because obesity now talking about, let's just consider the eats from the that people still, although I just mentioned it shouldn't be the case, but they still think that it has a negative connotation. And people now have drugs available to approach this. For a long time there was no drug. After people said that okay, diet and certain procedures or certain recommendations from various teas and various other these kind of magic diets, etc. But now there is a drug. I mean, the Ozempic, this GLP-1 agonists, which originally were discovered as anti-diabetic drugs, incretins, which is released from the intestine and then goes to the appetite center, suppressing it and also slowing the gastric movements. But then it turned out that these anti-diabetic drugs could really lead to lose of weight, and then they developed that version now with more this. Then in some countries it's now it can be prescribed for obesity. In the United States, it's another country. In our country, of course, it is not possible. But some people have to find a trick that they have already some signs of diabetes, or pre-diabetic states, and they convince the doctors, and sometimes they use a trick, and it is now it's even a crime for the doctors to prescribe it for obesity in this country. And some other countries are different. But the issue is that now it's the world is will build new factories just to produce a large amount for the whole world. So this will start to appear all around in societies that will appeal to take, and not just for obesity and metabolic sense, which make sense to treat them, but in a large so-called healthy population in which the overweight is a good healthy condition, but now they will start to, because of expectation, to be slim, to look like a fashion model or something like that. So that's again an evolution of human thinking, or what we may think, call it what to call. But this is coming, and in a very large way already here in some societies. It's still expensive, but the consumption, some estimates, there's also billions of people nowadays, millions, and that's we get to 10 billion and 100 billions, and because of the pressure from the society's perspective of how we should look. So that's an element of evolution in a way, in my view. I don't know how you see about it.
So I think you've raised a number of interesting questions there. I mean, using BMI to categorize obesity, it's an estimate of risk, and some people will have the risk and others will not show the metabolic risks, even at higher levels of BMI. Yes, there are drugs and they're starting to work, and so you could say that this is allowing industry to have both elements of energy balance. One bit of industry causes some people to gain excess weight, another part of industry deals with that. A lot of money will flow around that. So will people lose enough weight to actually end up metabolically healthy? I don't think we know that yet. You know, we're starting to see the drug used. It causes weight loss. That's great. But you know, people vary in whether they will or won't get diabetes at a certain level of overweight. There could be other drugs. There may be stem cell therapies for diabetes in the future. So there's certainly medical progress. There are two other issues that I think are really important to thinking about whether we can accept or not accept a global obesity epidemic. One is that even if you can address the health concerns, body weight scales with food intake, and therefore higher levels of body mass index across whole populations is a stress on the global food demand, global warming. So we could think about whether the planet can cope with an obesity epidemic, aside from whether individual health can cope with it. And the other is for children, because children have human rights. And the UN says human rights includes protection from harm. So if you think that obesity is a form of ill health, we kind of have an obligation to try and protect children from developing overweight in the first place. So I think there's a number of different angles that also come in. It's a debate. I mean, I think there's a number of different issues. It's not like there's a very simple response to the issues that you've raised, but I think you can put different issues on the page and say that they all merit thought. So yes, the fact that we have drugs that can induce weight loss, you can say that's a positive, but I'm not sure that it wipes clean the whole problem. It's one movement on the chessboard, but there are other things that we need to take into account as well. And I think for children get bullied at school because they're overweight. They have psychological costs as well as metabolic costs. And we could, as I say, maybe we have the obligation to try and protect them from that harm. So obesity is very, very complex. It isn't just how many calories are stored in the body. It's many of these other issues about mental health, planetary health. And that's why it's so complex, because it is the meeting point of many different issues.
Thanks so much. Very interesting talk. Early in your presentation, you said that fat buys time in terms of adaptation, allows for adaptations to emerge, I guess, evolutionarily. So it promotes plasticity, reduces the strength of selection. So this is very similar to cognition and brain science, right? And a lot of invasive, and think about invasive species and the ability to adapt to novel environments. And do you know any comparison or comparative study where the ability to put on fat and the role of fat is important in colonizing new environments in any other animal species, not just primates or apes, but other animal taxa?
Well, I think rats, which are a known invasive species, I think they do make use of body fat, and that's one of the reasons why they're a widely used rodent model of obesity. It's a great question. I should be able to give a better answer. I mean, it's not that they it's not that they colonize environments, but of all the apes, the orangutan gains and loses fat seasonally, and so it can tolerate seasonal variability. And it is interesting that the orangutan actually did colonize a lot of Asia. Maybe more than the chimpanzees managed within Africa. So it was difficult because, the remaining populations today are not where they were in the past. I'm not able to think off the top of my head, but lots of animals use fat to migrate, reindeer and so on. So logic suggests that the answer is yes, but I'm not managing to think of good examples. I think you'd probably find insects might have some examples as well. Birds obviously use fat to migrate. They're actually colonizing new environments. I'm not the right person to respond, but my prediction would be yes.
Can I have a follow-up to this? So is this related to like the lower metabolism that humans and other apes have? Like relative to the size of the mammal, we have a much lower total daily metabolism than any other mammals, I think. Is that right?
I think so. Humans, I know there's sort of a lot of debate about this, where human metabolism and primate metabolism is, and I think there's an ongoing argument about how human metabolism is low. Quite a funny metabolism, because if you just look per weight, which is often all we can do at mammals, having fat hides the fact that our lean tissue might actually be a bit more expensive. And then we have an expensive brain, and I think the kidneys, we've looked at this in some adult humans. The kidneys, the heart, and the brain, I think, are the three expensive tissues, but because the brain is large, it adds a lot to our BMR. So I think what humans have done is they've kind of changed where energy is used in the body. Some bits are cheaper, like muscle mass, some bits are more expensive, like the brain. I think being under muscle is a general primate trend. So compared to mammals in general, a sort of standard mammal of our body weight. Even primates start to show a trend to having less muscle mass, and then humans are a more extreme version of that. So I think we're thrifty with our lean tissue overall. But then, as I say, we've kind of played around a bit and managed to fund a big brain. There's the expensive tissue hypothesis that we have a smaller gut by cooking food. So we saved calories on the gut and we redirected them to the brain. So I think that's an ongoing debate, but it's not a very interesting area.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. So, as far as I understood, so you touched a lot on the causes of adiposity, right, in human evolution. But I don't know if you can share a little bit about the implications of the adiposity in the human evolution. Meaning, for example, now that you raised with the previous question, the fact that like some people get like bullied, or like in the last seminar, in humans you have this mobbing behavior, right? But so if one of the hypotheses of the causes of adiposity is cooperative breeding, or that you actually share the energy resources, but that causes them to gain more fat. But maybe, is there a hypothesis that maybe that in turn also causes mobbing behavior in humans? Or?
So one of the things that I think we can still say is under debate is when specific aspects of adipose tissue may have responded to selective pressures. We can make some predictions. I think when humans got bigger brains, that must have had implications for adipose tissue biology, buffering the brain as a baby, mothers having fat stores to fund lactation. Probably body fat and social cooperative breeding, probably they both emerged as different parts of the solution to this huge brains baby that's very metabolically expensive compared to a chimpanzee. So some of those things probably occurred quite early in human evolution, but that's a prediction. I don't know when we'll dig up fossils that allow us to confirm that. Probably the origins of agriculture also placed a lot of stress on adipose tissue by raising the infectious burden. And probably geneticists and molecular biologists may actually be able to tell us some of that, because you will know the signature of evolution, which genes are under positive selection, this kind of thing. We would love to do some data collection on foraging societies to see if, by nodding farmers, there's something different in their metabolism or their adipose tissue biology. But the problem there is there are fewer and fewer foragers, and many foragers today did a bit of farming in the past. So they're not necessarily completely protected from the lifestyle of farming. So we can, again, I think, predict that just like our capacity to digest starch diversified as humans started to eat different types of starch from forms of agriculture, we can predict that adipose tissue underwent similar diversification. But I think it's early days in trying to unravel those stories. So there's lots of different elements of risk management. Moving is one, cognitive solutions is another, storing energy in the body is just one more. But it seems to have been important. And so, yeah, I think in a way that's a hypothesis generating statement that body fat must have been important in human evolution. I think there's lots of evidence that it was, but I'm sure we could become much more confident if we did studies, collected more data, and so on. So I would say that it's the beginning of this issue, not the end of it. There's lots of interesting questions to explore.
Can we have one last? Yeah. So why do you define it as a thrifty trait? So, or what would be the difference between the trait being thrifty and maybe just being like phenotypically flexible?
Well, flexible.
Or what?
Thrifty, I think, means conserving resources. So I think that fat is a thrifty trait because you are not burning all the calories today. You're keeping some back. And that means that you're capping today's energy expenditure. It's the same as your bank account. Thrifty means not going out to an expensive restaurant every night. Because at some point you can't do that. So you always have something in your bank balance. So metabolically, I think it's the same. But yeah, there's many, I think that's one of the things I was trying to say, there's many different forms of thrift. Maintaining a low muscle mass is thrift. Slowing childhood growth is thrift. So in a sense, every trait could be on a continuum, more or less thrifty. Species could differ, populations could differ, individuals could differ. So it's a more or less thing rather than a yes or no thing.
Thanks.
Other questions? Then thank you again.